Hi, and welcome to another Fiber Friday. Um, Wonderful to have you guys here again. This time we're going to be talking about yarn packaging, everything from the yarn label, also referred to as a ball band, to yarn weights, wraps per inch, some of the basics that you'll find around the yarn labels, so that way it can help you choose the right yarn for the project. What we're not going to be discussing is yarn material. So that is acrylic, cotton, etc. There's just too much there to go with, and that's not where I'm going to be starting. So depending on the project type you're going to make, you'll want to pick the material that you're going to go with. Acrylic being amongst some of the cheapest, whereas the material types go up from there. You can get some really expensive ones, hand-dyed, all of that. We're also going to be covering the packaging type, how to read the label, and how to determine the weight and everything. So let's go ahead and get started, and thank you guys so much for joining me. I'm going to go over a couple of things when it comes to how the yarn is packaged, common terminology that you'll hear with this. I am also going to include, and going forward, there'll be a small section for a couple of different videos covering some of the most common acronyms for anything new where I'm teaching, because some of these acronyms are going to get a little confusing if you're not very familiar with them. So the first thing I'm going to cover is going to be, what is the difference in the type of yarn packaging that you'll find, starting with the more natural fibers, and that which you will find primarily but not exclusively in some of the local yarn shops, is going to be where you're going to find things mostly hanging in hanks, which are often a twisted hank. And what that is, I'm going to give a very terrible example of it, is they're going to take yarn and wind it to where it looks kind of like this, much larger, much more dense, because it's obviously going to have a full skein worth of yarn. They'll twist it a few dozen times, and then it'll twist kind of like that. Now this is a very micro size one, not very well done, but they'll typically be hanging on a wall with their yarn label attached. If you get a hank, you will either need to have the shop wind it, or have a swift and winder, or have help use a chair. There are a number of different ways to prepare the hank for use. It is not a ready to use unless you want to deal with a yarn tangle nightmare. There are many videos out there, and I may eventually cover one. I don't currently have any hanks, so I'm not going to be able to do that. But there is a chance in the future I will be picking up more yarn that is bound in a hank, and I will show you some ways that you can use to prepare that for use. I briefly showed the Kobo cake of yarn. This one typically has the yarn from the center here. You can either get it from the top or the bottom to pull there, and there is one underneath the ball band that will have the outside string. So depending on if you wish to put it on something like this where you just set it there and it'll rotate so you can pull from the outside, or whether you prefer to go from a center pull. The differences there is the center pull, oftentimes you'll get a small amount of yarn barf because very few skeins of yarn will actually come out nice and smoothly. It's not to say that they all are like that. I have this one that I've been working with for a while that has the nice center pull. It just depends on the yarn, how it's wound, and whether or not it's going to pull neatly. If you don't like the cake, you can just wind it into a ball of yarn where you just make a ball out of it. I don't have a good example for the donut ball, but it's essentially similar to taking the yarn cake and a regular ball and kind of smashing them together to make a ball out of it. It looks a little bit like a donut. This style packaging here is typically referred to as a skein of yarn or a skein. I have only ever pronounced it as skein, so if that bothers you, sorry, it's how I was raised. It's what I'm going to call them. With that, again, there'll be an outer thread yarn wrapped around the outside, and then the center pull. How you choose to use it will be up to you on that. There's different preferences. The other one that I am familiar with, but I don't have, is a cone of yarn. The cone is going to have a hard, usually cardboard center where the yarn is wrapped around it in the shape of a cone. That's just going to be the most common packaging that I have become aware of. If you know of any others, I would love to know and know what brands they are, because it would be interesting to look into that. But that's going to be how the yarn is packaged. Okay, so as you can see here, this is a Big Twist label. That's the brand. I'm using one of my amigurumi ones. Now, for this, on theirs, they put their 70% acrylic and the 30% polyamide. That's what it's made of. It's on the front part of the label on this one, as well as the yardage, ounces, meters, and grams. So depending on how your pattern is written, those numbers will be the ones you're going to look at for how much yarn you're going to want to get of a type of yarn material. On the label, on this side here, it's going to have not only where it was made and the year, typically, where the company's located. This one here is made in Turkey. It's going to have the colorway. This can either be a name, a number, or a combination of those. Then it's going to have your lot number. This can be important if you're working with larger projects or projects that you possibly are going to put down for a number of years and you may need another skein of yarn. It is important that you get enough yarn for your project in order to complete it, or possibly, even though we don't like to waste any, it's better to have a little bit extra than not quite enough and lose it yarn chicken. For those of you who are not aware, yarn chicken is where you're coming down to your last few stitches and you're just about out of yarn and you may or may not have enough yarn in order to complete the project based off of what you have. It's better to not risk yarn chicken, especially as a beginner, than it is to risk it. If you don't get from the same dye lot, there is a chance that there will be a slight difference in shade and color and vibrancy. You may or may not notice this. You may or may not care about it depending on what your project is for. But be aware that you will want to try to make sure that your lot number matches across all yarn that you're buying from that same color. On the other side of the yarn label, you're going to have some very basic laundry symbols and written instructions on how to properly handle, care, and take care of. Not all yarn labels will include this. This one includes both. I have seen just the written instructions and I have seen just the symbols on yarn labels. Some, but not all, yarn labels will contain a small section here of, for example, if in this size of skein, you are trying to do a blanket that is 50 inches by 60 inches using the suggested hook size and achieving the suggested gauge for said blanket and hook size, it should take 8 skeins of yarn in order to accommodate that 50 by 60 inch blanket, or approximately 7 skeins of yarn for an adult size sweater, 2 for a hat, and 4 for a scarf. And that is on an estimated average and not specific to, an adult plus size or a skinny adult. There can be varying factors that affect that. One of which is your gauge. Now, this one's unfortunately a small label, so it's kind of hard to get in, and I don't have a very good zoom feature right now. However, the suggested hook size for this amigurumi yarn is a C2 or 2.75 millimeter crochet hook. If you were to be doing knitting, it's going to recommend a 4 millimeter or a US 6. Not all yarn labels will include both crochet and knitting. I have seen more often than not, especially with the natural fibers, they'll include just the knitting instructions for gauge, not so much the crochet. Now, the other things that are a little hard to see here is across the top and the side of this, it's giving me the gauge sizing, which is a 4 inch by 4 inch, also seen as the 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter written across the top. Now that is in both squares. In the knitting section, it'll say 22 stitches by 28 rows. In the crochet, it'll say 27 single crochet by 26 rows. What that means is when you do the appropriate number of stitches, whether they are the single crochet or the knit stitches, and then you do the number of rows that it is listing in each of those, it should come out to that 4 inch by 4 inch or 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter square. If it doesn't, then your gauge is off. Now I'm going to go ahead and use this Kobo yarn by Lion Brand as another label example. On this one, it doesn't give you a whole lot of information here on the front half of the ball band, or yarn label as they are also referred to. But as I turn it over toward the barcode, above the barcode I've got not only a color number, but I also have that color name. And then I have my lot number here. What does that say? And it does say an article number. I'm not certain exactly what that is with Lion Brand. But the color number, name, and lot are on this right above the barcode. If I continue to rotate the yarn label, I have my laundry symbols. I have my crochet hook and my knitting hooks. And again, it's got their respective measurements with their suggested hook sizing on this. Slightly further over, right here, I've got my ounces, grams, yards, meters, the buildup of what it's made of. For this one, the 15% cotton, 94% rayon from bamboo, and then it goes continuing back around. This one does also include the laundry instructions written underneath all of that. Now, I didn't cover it on the other one, but I'm going to cover it right now. The two different yarns, you'll see that there is a ball of yarn with a number. On the Big Twist amigurumi one, it's a 2, and it has the listing of definition as being fine. Whereas my 3 is listed as being light from the Cut Bop, or not Cut Bop, I'm hungry, sorry, Kobo. Depending on the yarn sizing you're going to be using, those numbers will reflect what type of yarn weight, and those will correspond to why the suggested hook sizes are the way they are. All right, one of the more tedious things about learning about yarn, and that I personally am still learning about, so I am not an expert. I actually didn't start learning about these, ironically, until I started learning how to knit. And it's where I learned some of the names and where they associated with that little ball symbol. Wish I had a larger yarn label to show you on that. Unfortunately, I don't. But it does just look like a skein of yarn with a number here on the label. Sorry, it's not great. However, those are listed as yarn weights, and they typically go from 0 to, I've seen up to a 7. I'm sure that they probably go above that for like hand yarn, which is the ones that are about the size of my wrist and above, and you're using your hand to work with them. I don't know if those actually have a different labeling style. I've not seen the label on those. All the yarn charts that I have or have seen only go from 0 to 7, with 0 being your smallest yarn size. And it's listed from lace weight, super fine, fine, light, medium, bulky, super bulky, and jumbo. Now, those terms will also be listed under a name, which is where I got the absolute most confused inside of a yarn store the first time. Lace weight is also sometimes referred to as fingering weight. The superfine is baby weight, sock weight, and also listed as fingering. You get to the fine, which lists as baby weight and sport weight, and continuing down from double knit, light worsted, Afghan, Aran, chunky, craft yarn, rug yarn, super chunky, roving, ultra roving. That's what's on my chart. I don't actually know on that one. I've also heard a couple of the terms in there. I don't have them memorized or on my chart, so I don't know. On the chart that I typically use, I wish I could show it to you, but it is not my chart, and I cannot share it because it's not, I don't have permission. But on it, it's got lace, doilies, and shawls under the fingering weight. And under the superfine, it'll have lace, doilies, and shawls as well. What that means is both of those can be used for those levels. Now, my amigurumi yarn that I have here that I use to make, I'm going to go ahead and slip back here and grab Charizard for this. Sorry about the wiggles. But I used some amigurumi yarn from Big Twist for this guy. I showed him off in my very first video. He is not 100% done. However, on this label, it lists the yarn type as being a number 2 fine weight. And it worked great for the amigurumi. It was obviously designed for that, considering that was the yarn type that I used. So my common projects that are listed here are not by any means an end-all be-all, this is all that they're good for, because amigurumi isn't listed on mine until it hits a 3. But obviously, I have a yarn that's designed for amigurumi, and it's at a 2 weight. So you just have to adjust your hook size and what type. I have shown in my first video my little micro bee, which was made out of a thread weight instead of a standard yarn. So your projects can be done in any material. It just these are typical projects used out of those sizing. Now, with the phrasing such as fingering weight, lace weight, on my personal chart, it's got a guideline of some ranges of hooks that I could use on here. So, for example, my lace weight that I have, my recommended needle sizing goes from 1.5 millimeters up to about a 2.25. The next one, the Superfine, has a recommended hook range of 2.25 up to 3.25. Now that doesn't mean that's what I exactly need for each project. That's just the recommended hook size for each yarn type. That doesn't mean you can't use a 6 millimeter hook on a fine that recommends the 3.25 to 3.75. It just means that you will lose some stitch definition, and you'll be given a whole different stitch design using the same stitches that we're going to learn later on. So depending on how you want your project to look, you can go up a size or down a size in hook sizing. And as I mentioned when I was covering the labels, the gauging, if you're following a specific pattern and you're adjusting that pattern to account for example, they used a worsted medium weight, and you're going to be using a light worsted weight, you're going to need to adjust your gauge if you're going to be following stitch by stitch for their pattern and you don't have enough experience to know if you need to add more stitches or remove, because I have no idea how to do that. I do, however, know that if they've given me a gauge that says I should have, so many stitches within a 4x4 range, and I want to go down a yarn size or up a yarn size, I may want to either go down a hook size or up a hook size in order to get that gauge with that same yarn, so when my project comes out matching what it should following their pattern. As you get better, you'll hear different people referring to something as, oh, I'm going to go ahead and grab my worsted weight or my Aran weight. It'll help you know, okay, this is somewhat of where we're landing. For a good example of that, the medium 4 worsted weight, heavy worsted, and Aran are often comparable in size to your standard Red Heart acrylic, which is usually a 4 medium. So that's what you're generally going to be thinking in terms of size. Now, they can go up a size and down a size within the same worsted, heavy worsted, Aran, all of those. So this one has 1, 2, 3. So this yarn is a 6-stranded yarn. And even though it does fall in a 1 Superfine, the makeup of this particular Baby Bunny by Big Twist has the 6 strands. It's a number 1 Superfine. If I were to have, say, had one that was a 3 or 4 strand, it may land in a lace weight. And if it had 8 strands, it could land in the fine weight. It's where you get some of that overlapping of the lace weight 0 and Superfine 1. Both have the listing of fingering weight, is that typically crosses over that boundary and can either be a very thick lace weight or a very thin fine weight. It also happens a lot of times with the acrylic yarns and the medium worsted, where they are borderlining on a light worsted, the heavy worsted are they a 3-weight, 4-weight, or 5-weight, depending on how many strands, how thick the fiber naturally is. So be aware of that, just because, when you're buying yarn, if this one is a 3-weight and I were to grab another yarn that said it was a 3-weight and they look like they're different sizes, that's why they are going to be slightly crossing over. And it's an unfortunate thing that can be tedious, but once you get working with yarn regularly, you'll know which yarns tend to do that more than others. Okay, so what are you going to do if you've got just a random ball of yarn? You don't know exactly whether it's a, fingering, a sport, a DK, worsted, RN. You don't know, it came to you with no label, and you're wanting to know so that way you know what kind of yarns to either pair it with, or using one of the aforementioned types of charts that has suggested hook sizes. Since you don't have a label to get that suggested hook size, how do you figure that out? Well, there's a very simple method that it's simpler than it sounds. I'm going to start there. And I'm also going to start with our acronym of the week for this one. Okay, so hopefully if I am getting any better at this editing process, I will be able to put the symbols here. If not, I'm so sorry. I really hope I can actually accurately get this. But the acronyms that we're going to be comparing, so that way you know the difference, are the wraps per inch, WPI, or work in progress, WIP. That's important to know because you'll see people using these acronyms on videos, and in the videos, or they'll just be saying, oh, I've got a WIP, work in progress. And usually with wraps per inch, I've only ever seen it in the written patterns. And it's telling you, an approximated wraps per inch for a project. It's not super common, but it's not common. It's common enough I've seen it. Now, what that means is to find the weight of a yarn that you don't have a label for, you're simply going to wrap the yarn around something. This something can be a ruler, it can be a pen, it can be the end of your crochet hook. You can buy some of these fancy little devices. This one here is measured out at exactly 1 inch and has some of these guideline numbers going down it. Now, when I compare this, what I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and use my crochet hook for this for real quick. I'm going to wrap it so that my yarn wraps tightly next to each other. They're squished in. There's no real gapping there, but they're not overlapping each other. You do not want it to overlap. If you overlap it, you're going to get an inaccurate measurement. And if you have gaps like that, you're also going to get an inaccurate measurement. You want to push it up snugged up next to it until you hit about 1 inch. You can go over 1 inch, that's okay. It just gives you more to work with to get your measurement. And then you're going to take whatever device you have that has an inch measurement, and you're going to lay it over it. Now, if you're doing this wraps per inch on a ruler, you can just wrap it around a single inch. If you're using it here on a crochet hook, you can just measure it that way. And then you're going to count each and every strand of yarn that you have wrapped, and how many times you've wrapped it around that material will give you your wraps per inch. Now, depending on the chart you're using, your chart will have some overlap. Again, as I mentioned in the weight, where the fingering weight was listed under the fine and lace weight, baby yarn was under the fine and super fine. Could be, sorry, I don't have those in front of me. My names might be a little off. Yeah. But depending on where they land and which gauge you're using to read this, will tell you which measurement you're going to be using to get your estimated yarn weight. Now, there are ways to work with the yarn without needing those. It just depends on how intricate your project is. And that is a whole separate video that I may come up with down the line. I myself am not 100% experienced in that, so I don't know if I could speak to it yet. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. Thank you for joining me on this week's Fiber Friday. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, do all this stuff, hit the bell, all of that. Again, I really appreciate you guys being here. If you had any comments, questions, or anything on this video, please feel free to put that in the chat, and I would be wonderful to hear from you guys. Anyway, I thank you guys for being here again, and have a wonderful day.